Good afternoon, and thank you for attending today's webinar. My name is Jennifer Cooley, and I am the Education and Outreach Manager for the State Historical Museum. Thank you for attending the Iowa History 101 webinar series today, focusing on how the arrival of horseless carriages changed the lives of rural and urban Iowans. The Iowa History 101 series takes place on the second and fourth Thursdays through August, as we share the stories of past lives of Iowans. Please refer to our website, iowaculture.gov/history, to learn more about this series and our other virtual programs. A few housekeeping points before I introduce our speaker. Everyone came into this webinar on mute with cameras off. The webinar is being recorded and will be placed on the Iowa Culture page of YouTube in a few days. I have disabled the chat function, but if you have a question, please type it into the Q&A feature throughout the webinar. My colleague Matt Beyer is watching that feature and will prepare a list of questions for the speaker at the end of the presentation. But please note, we may not be able to get to all of the questions. Now I'm happy to introduce our speaker, State Curator Leo Landis. Leo has his Bachelor's of Science in History from Iowa State University and a Master's of Arts in Historical Administration from Eastern Illinois University. He has completed all but his dissertation towards a PhD in history from Iowa State. His museum experience includes time at Living History Farms in Urbandale, Conner Prairie in Fishers, Indiana, and 8 years as curator at Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan. He has also worked as a curator and director of education at Salisbury House in Des Moines. Now I'm very happy to turn it over to Leo to begin the webinar.
Well, thank you, Jennifer. Thank you, Matt, and thank you to all of you for joining us today to talk about automobiles in Iowa. And the topics I want to talk about are early automobiles, Iowa-made automobiles, a term that got used in different ways, but solving the automobile problem and how that allowed Iowans then to say, okay, we're ready to drive. Iowa roads, which is related to the automobile problem, and then some social issues. And so just to say I'm 3 for 3 on photos. That's me in the back seat of a Model T with my mom at the wheel, my wife Nancy in the back seat with me, and my sister Teresa. That's at Henry Ford Museum in 1998. So I never drove a Model T. They're a little tough to drive. I did drive Model A's when I was at Henry Ford Museum in Greenfield Village. So I've driven a Model A on a number of occasions. I've never driven a Model T, but you can see I've sat in one. Let's talk about a timeline first and just how automobiles became widely available and some benchmarks. So 1904 is the first year Iowa requires licenses for automobiles. That's not for the driver, it's just for the automobile itself. And it was sent to the Secretary of State. So 1904 is the first year that Iowa requires you to have a license on your automobile. 1905, the Iowa Highway Commission was established. It was at Iowa State. It wasn't its own separate department per se until 1914. And then other benchmarks, and we sometimes consider that Henry Ford is the father of the automobile. He is in some ways, but he had many contributions. One of the first being the fighting of a patent that had been taken in 1895 called the Selden patent that was on all automobiles. And if you were manufacturing an automobile in the United States, you had to pay a licensing fee to an automotive group. And the patent was held by a lawyer named Selden. And so 1911, Henry Ford wins that patent suit and really allows for an even larger explosion of automobiles. 1912, Charles Kettering of Dayton, Ohio, develops the self-starter. He actually developed it in 1911. Cadillac starts putting it on their vehicles in 1912. So that's the electric ignition. Today, a lot of us use push buttons. Older folks, we grew up sticking a key in the ignition. A lot of folks still do that too. The self-starter is what that is called. So you didn't have to crank a car beginning in 1912 on some vehicles. So 1912 is a big deal. 1913, the moving assembly line is introduced by Henry Ford at the Highland Park plant. So instead of, and as I'll show you in some photos of workmen standing around a vehicle and putting on parts, you get the moving assembly line that allows for mass production of automobiles. Then 1914, Henry Ford introduces the $5 workday late in the year. That allows workers to purchase their automobiles. And Iowa did have a Ford assembly plant in Des Moines, so that $5 a day feature was important to workers. It also raised wages across the board so that other town folks who were paid a wage could afford to buy automobiles. So between the assembly line and rising wages, it made vehicles more affordable and allowed them to be a worker to have a decent wage to be able to purchase them. 1916 is when the Federal Highway Commission, or what becomes the Federal Highway Commission and then later the Federal DOT, establishes the Federal Aid Road Act that creates the basis for federal leadership in highway construction. So that's a benchmark. Then 1925, Alfred Sloan of General Motors hires a West Coast designer named Harley Earl, and that's when GM across the line with Chevrolet, Buick, Pontiac, Cadillac starts both making niche cars for segments of the audience or consumers, and also then does design tweaks on an almost annual basis so that cars become stylistically different year to year or over a few years. And it is the basis for what's called planned obsolescence, whereas Americans start thinking, oh, you need the latest style change. So that's a change that happens in this period of about 1900 to 1930. And then 1926 is when the United States and a group of national engineers, the federal government and an highway engineers group, create the numbered system that we know today with routes like Highway 218 that's in eastern Iowa running north-south, US 20 that goes from Sioux City to Dubuque, or US 30. 1926 is when that numbering system is developed. And apologies to any favorite highways, federal highways that didn't get named. So we'll talk about this period 1900 roughly, and a little bit earlier, up to about 1930, and how Iowans then started using and became accustomed to automobiles. One of my favorite newspaper articles that I found talks about the Lincoln Highway in east central Iowa in Benton County. So this is from the Vinton, Iowa paper, talking about a trip to Belle Plaine from I think it's Eden Township is where the Goodell family lives at the time. And it says, in motoring to Belle Plaine and back yesterday, where they attended the funeral of a relative, Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Goodell, Mrs. Clifford Norwood, and Mrs. Kenneth Shaw were delayed for hours by the condition of the roads. On the Lincoln Highway, the car had to be lifted out of the ditch. At one place on the Lincoln Highway, 13 cars were stuck in the mud. One machine was in so deep that it had to be left. It was impossible to pull it out. So that period in early March into the spring and summer, as Iowa gets a lot of the rainfall, and especially in the early spring, as the roads have thawed, were really difficult. And that's one of the problems we'll talk about a little bit later. But even in the 1920s, as cars were more available and the Iowa Highway Commission had been established to create better roadways, Iowans were still struggling. So let's talk about some early automobiles. Iowa has a claim on one of the very first, what would be called a horseless carriage, or what Morrison called his electric carriage. He was a Scottish birth inventor living in Des Moines, and he created an electric motor carriage. He really knew batteries, and so he had a little factory at 309 East First Street, so just a few blocks from the Historical Museum, where I am today, at the historical building. And so Morrison's electric carriage is one of the first ways that central Iowans see what is the beginning of automobiles. So electric cars predate or are contemporary to gasoline and steam-powered automobiles. One of the transformative vehicles in national history is Duryea, his gasoline-powered automobile. He was from Massachusetts, Springfield, I believe, and this is one of his prototypes, but in 1895, 1896, they then go into production of a larger run and create the really first practical gasoline automobile. And gasoline's advantages are it's relatively cheap as a fuel, and it also is an easy engine to develop and gives a reasonable amount of power compared to steam and electric. So if you want to move a little faster, gasoline is more efficient at that. So the Duryea automobile really is considered the first functional gasoline-powered automobile or liquid fuel. I referenced Morrison as an electric automobile, and then we just talked about Duryea. Steam, which inventors were familiar with from locomotives and also steamships, was another power source that was being experimented. Here's a Locomobile. It was made also in Massachusetts, and later the company moved to Bridgeport, Connecticut, but the early versions were made in Massachusetts. This one was used by William Haskell of Cedar Rapids. At the time, he was a businessman who later went on to the city council and served in the Iowa legislature. But automobiles, as you would see, were used by wealthy people in the early 1900s, even through about 1910. And so wealthy people, urban folks, usually saw automobiles as a new invention that was to be experimented with. And so William Haskell of Cedar Rapids in Lynn County, there was a nice little article about him driving this car in the Cedar Rapids Evening Gazette of August 8th, 1900, saying, W.G. Haskell and George Henderson left this morning for Belle Plaine. Mr. Haskell will run his locomobile back to all the towns between here and Belle Plaine today. So that route, much similar to the Goodell route that I referenced earlier, traveling to Belle Plaine, must have been quite a pleasant drive for some of those folks in the early 1900s. But steam power, the problem with steam is you don't just go out and jump into your steam automobile. You have to, this was kerosene powered, so you ignite the fire to heat up the water in the boiler. That would take maybe 15 minutes to 30 minutes. And then your running time might only be 3 or 4 hours on that steam before you'd have to either get more kerosene or refill the boiler on your automobile. So steam powered cars were experimented with through the early 1900s into the 19-teens, but really by 1910, electric and gasoline were the main vehicles. And this is one, as I referenced, that's in the collections of the State Historical Museum of Iowa. And we're grateful to the Haskell family who donated it a number of years ago. Another early effort used by an Iowan in Madison County, a man who was a lumber dealer over near Patterson, I believe. He saw this vehicle at the 1901 Chicago Automobile Show, had it shipped to Des Moines, and you'll notice on it, you can see just above the red bench seat, there's sticking toward the screen a little wooden handle. So a lot of these early automobiles have not a steering wheel, but a tiller, wooden handle that turns the wheels. Also looking at the wheels as well, they look like bicycle wheels, wire spokes with rubber tires. So taking those technologies like the steam automobile and using them as you know them. So the Knox was promoted as a waterless automobile, meaning it didn't have a radiator. On the engine block are several hundred little metal studs, almost like a 1/4-inch bolt with its head sawn off. So all the little studs, and that would radiate the heat from the engine. Was not a real function. It was functional enough, but compared to a water-cooled engine, just did not make sense in the long run. So the waterless Knox automobile was not a real popular one in the end, though the user of this one, Mr. Speer was his name, S-P-E-E-R. He took it with him to Washington, D.C. when he left Iowa, and then later donated it in the 1920s to the State Historical Museum. Another example that's in the State Historical Museum collection, this is a 1903 Cadillac that was used in Polk and Decatur County. Again, taking those technologies that you know, essentially a buggy frame, mounting that onto a set of axles, and then in this case, more like a wagon wheel with wooden spokes, and then the rubber tired wheels and the steering wheel, you'll notice on this one is on the left. That was, excuse me, on the right. That was pretty typical through the early 1900s. We have a Buick in our collection from Northwest Iowa, from up around Sheldon. That family bought a 1913 Buick. It was the last year Buick made a right-hand drive. And part of that was that it let you have a better view of the edge of the road, but also it let you in town get off at the curb as opposed to having to get out in the middle of the street, which might be muddy if it was a dirt road. And so let's talk about some Iowa-made automobiles. Here you can see the Mason Motor Company assembly room, just a couple of blocks south from today's State Historical Building. The site of the Mason Company was at East 5th and Vine Street. This is a shot from the State Historical Society of Iowa collections in Des Moines. Thanks to my colleague Becky Plunkett for putting a great batch of photos together for me to use. And so here you see the pre-assembly line, and this is part of the challenge that small automobile manufacturers face, is that you're standing at a spot and assembling the pieces onto the frame. So you aren't having pieces move to you, you have to bring the pieces to the point of manufacture. So you really can't increase your productivity. The great stories about Mason, they're a company that starts about 1907 here in Des Moines, and George Mason was the founder of the company. He hires two brothers from Rockford, Iowa, so north central Iowa, just south of Mason City, west of Charles City. And those two brothers are August and Frederick Duesenberg. And they are really great at designing and building automobiles. They later go on to be famous for their own automobile, the Duesenberg, and it was quite a high-end automobile, the Duesenberg was, but the Mason was a great vehicle too. They were good engineers and builders, but the term "it's a doozy" comes from August and Frederick Duesenberg. So older listeners may know the term "it's a doozy." That comes from Iowans, the designer and engineer on the Mason motor car. And here is a Mason that's in the collection here at the State Historical Museum of Iowa, fully restored and two seats. The thing about these early automobiles, it was often a motor or a gasoline engine mounted underneath the seat, and the Cadillac in the collection is the same way. The rear wheels are powered by a chain, and to start that motor, you turn a crank. So just below that kind of half moon or half circle shape in the left side of the image, center is the crank for the Mason automobile. So you turn that crank, that ignites the spark in the engine and starts the engine, and then you can engage the gears to drive. But these early automobiles often use a chain. So on the lower right, I know it's a little tough to see, but the chain runs from the gasoline motor to the back axle. And so these are chain drive vehicles. It's where you take the motor, have a gear on it, and then have a gear on the rear axle, and a chain drives the rear axle, is the power system. And one of the big feats in Iowa to promote your automobile was to climb the state capitol steps. So we have a number of photographs in the State Historical Society of Iowa collections showing vehicles climbing the steps of the state capitol. So here's one of the Mason in about 1907. Here's the Mason at the Iowa State Fair at about 1909. Again, having enough horsepower to climb Iowa hills was a big deal. So showing the hill climbing ability was important, and many companies build their automobiles as excellent hill climbers. Here's the Carter Car Company. Again, similar stunt. The Carter was not actually an Iowa-made automobile, but the Spalding, which was made in Grinnell, that was an Iowa-made automobile that climbed the steps of the state capitol as well. So typical of those promotional efforts, crowd would gather, the automobile company would have representatives there talking about the quality of its vehicle and do the stunt of driving up the steps of the state capitol. So what were some of the challenges? And I love this ad from the Iowa Homestead, a farm newspaper or farm magazine published out of Des Moines here, just on Grand Avenue is where their offices were. And this ad goes on to say, it's just the kind of car you want and thought possibly you could not afford. A car with the same splendid standard features that are found on the highest priced machines. And then at the bottom of that first column says, the Badger car is solving the automobile problem for farmers all over the country. It will solve it for you. We urge you to write for a booklet giving complete specifications and our wonderfully attractive proposition on the Badger motor car. And then if you jump over to the right column, it says the Badger car is noted for its simplicity. Women and children drive it easily with perfect safety. And then it goes on to talk about its features. Tire troubles, the largest item of upkeep expense on other cars, are such rare occurrences as to be practically entirely avoided, yet you get the benefit of easy riding qualities of the finest pneumatic tires. So this one had solid rubber tires. I bet it was not an easy ride. And I didn't point it out on the Mason or the Cadillac, but these vehicles used spring steel. They weren't shock absorbers like we think of today to make a smooth ride. It was the same type of seat and springs that were used on wagons and buggies to soften that ride, but it really was not the kind of ride we're accustomed to. So know that the experience you had on these vehicles was not the sort of smooth ride that we're accustomed to getting. That was one of the advantages that manufacturers like Morrison and high-wheeled vehicles would argue, is that their vehicles rode a little smoother. And so there were a few efforts to make high-wheel vehicles through this period. Well, what are some of the automobile problems? The first that we'll talk about is that these new inventions or developments on the roadways were frightening to horses. And Iowa had over 1 million horses in the 19-teens across the state being used for personal transportation or farming. And so here's an article from the Davenport Democrat, April 12th, 1903. I purposely didn't want to grab one that was too alarming. This one is pretty benign. It says, Emil Geist of 1317 West 4th Street was slightly injured about the head and body Saturday by being tossed out of a grocer's delivery wagon near 4th and Warren Streets. The horses were frightened by a passing automobile, and their sudden dash unseated him. His brother John Geist was in the wagon and succeeding in halting the horses before any further damage was done. There are dozens of stories through the 1900s, 19-teens, 1920s of Iowans losing their lives because an automobile frightened a team of horses. There's a nice article in a palimpsest about our Cadillac in the collection. Ralph Silver of Decatur County talks about what the standard practice was on Iowa roads in the early 1900s when an automobile would encounter a team of horses or someone driving a team of horses. And so it says, the farmer raised his arm, which was the signal for us to pull to the side of the road and shut off the engine while he got past. The next one we met had us stop while he opened a gate and drove into the field. The next one was a young man and his girl. He got the horse and buggy tied to the fence and motioned us to proceed, but the horse reared up, and I heard afterwards the man got a broken nose. So again, not too injurious to that young man, but automobiles were disturbing to horses. So I know of a Denison, Western Iowa town. The Denison paper had an article in the 19-teens talking about how farmers had been anti-automobile through the early 1900s, but as either horses became accustomed to the vehicles or more and more farmers started using the vehicles on their own and not using horses, the opposition to automobiles started to diminish. But into the 1920s, 1930s, automobiles were still causing a problem for Iowa farmers. It's just they became so prevalent that they won the day. But in the 19-teens, the roadways belonged to everyone, not just the automobile like we think of it today. Another problem with Iowa roads is that we have great soil, but it makes for challenging roadways, as we talked about in the springtime. Also in the fall, it could be challenging as well. So here's the Lincoln Highway. We'll talk a bit more about it. Just east of State Center, so Marshall County. And looking at the roadway, it's really one path when it's a dirt road. If you're off on the shoulder, and the idea was to build a crown on the roadway so that water went toward the ditch and the main path was then through the center. But if you got off toward the edge of the roadway, that's where you would get mired in the mud and be stuck. So solving the quality of roads was one of those automobile problems that needed to be addressed as well. And as that Badger motor car advertisement mentioned, the most challenging expense that you had besides fuel was replacing tires and replacing inner tubes. So here's a nice image of changing a flat tire from the State Historical Society of Iowa collections, a group on an outing, and the car is jacked up, the tire is removed, and a new inner tube being put in. So you didn't take off the hubcap or the rim, you took off the tire, just like changing a bike tire today. That's part of, again, that technology, using what you knew. It was much like a bicycle tire is today, where you could remove the tire, replace the inner tube, and then be back on your way. So most cars carried a handful of, most drivers, most wise drivers, carried a handful of spare inner tubes as they were driving across the countryside or through town. But especially if you were doing an outing through the countryside, you'd want to have a spare tire. The story connected to this one is they said they didn't know what caused the blowout. Well, what addresses some of those road problems in Iowa, and this is a story worth knowing, is the Iowa Highway Commission, but also those early engineers. The Iowa Highway Commission, as I referenced, was first established at Iowa State, then the Iowa State College of Agriculture. And Anson Marston was the primary civil engineer. He became dean of the college shortly thereafter when the Highway Commission was established. But when it was established, he had trained a number of young men to address highway engineering, and really they were looking at the roads for farm transportation. That was one of the challenges. We were a state that relied on farm commerce, and also many of the farmers were paying the taxes or doing the work to keep up the roads in their communities. So how do you get farmers to support improved roads? Well, you put the Highway Commission at Iowa State College, which amongst prosperous farmers and progressive farmers had good support, and you have professional training in road building. And one of the things that takes place in 1905 is promoting improved road graders. So you've got the King Road drag in the upper right. That was promoted by the Highway Commission, and also they had taken trains around the state of Iowa promoting improved seed corn in the early 1900s. So Thomas McDonald, the main employee of the Highway Commission, he was from Poweshiek County. He had been born in Colorado, but came to Iowa as a fairly young man. He is the first full-time employee for the Iowa Highway Commission. He travels across the state on a railroad car, both a north-south and I believe they do an east-west one, or they do an east-west, but also a north-south, or maybe it's a northern and southern route that they take. Anyway, McDonald his senior thesis at Iowa State under Anson Marston, who Marston Hall at Iowa State is named for. McDonald does his on improved roads for farmers. So he can say, I've done the research and I know what make the best roads, and I know the systems that we know to keep up our roads. And so the Iowa Highway Commission gets out there early 1905 and promotes improved roads for farmers, but it also benefits automobiles. There had actually been a good roads movement that started in the late 1800s that was generally the bicyclists of the United States who were supporting it. But bicycling was not going to improve roadways across the nation. So there had to be support to gain improved roads in other ways. And this was the approach the State Highway Commission, or the Iowa Highway Commission, used. And amongst the work that had to be done, and I'm sorry, I didn't quite get this done, but this is Green Bay Township, or I didn't quite get it as big as I wanted. The township trustees were in charge through the early 1900s of making sure the roads were kept up. So this is Green Bay Township, Clark County. It comes from the Osceola Democrat of March 13th, 1913. You'll see that their report to the supervisors is being published in the paper, and it says, we, Jerry Landis, F.E. Wallace, and E.C. Staley, trustees of Green Bay Township in said county and state, hereby make the following itemized statements on the amount of road funds received and expended. And this was part of the Iowa Highway Commission taking over additional administration. Actually, in 1915 is when fully the state road system is established, and the state has oversight of those roads and especially bridges. And apologies for any ancestral nepotism, but if you look at disbursements on that first column, the left side, the very first disbursement listed in December 7th, 1911 is to F.E. Landis for the Clerk's Commission, and he does some road work as well. That is my grandfather in Clark County, Green Bay Township, who was doing road work. I know there's a couple of other examples in the listing where, so May 14th in that first column, May 14th, F.E. Landis for making road drags. So good chance he was making things like those King road drags. Usually what would happen is a group of farmers would either bring their team of horses and help drag the roads, or provide labor to help clean up the roads, or pay a fee. So getting those farmers on board with the idea of how to improve their roadways, not only through the Good Roads train that the Highway Commission created and the publishing of designs, there were a number of ways that you could pay your road tax. I see on the second column, on November 4th, 1912, that's Arthur Landis, my grandfather's brother, so my dad's uncle, who AM, doing some road work, road dragging. So I won't make you pay any more attention to family history on this slide, but these are the sorts of reports and the sorts of improvements that were being done all across our state to prepare roadways for automobiles. And I reference 1926 as the year that the federal system of road numbering is created. The Iowa Department of Transportation has this great online map that they created. It's a poster. I don't believe there are any more available. It was done a number of years ago, that show the different routes across the state. There were over 50, maybe 60, excuse me, over 60 different routes that were registered with the Secretary of State and the Iowa Highway Commission. So symbols were painted on telephone poles to help you know you were following the right route. And I'll bring up some different routes from across the state, but you can just see there were different ways, and usually it was local promoters who were trying to either increase commerce or say, hey, we're a progressive place, you should come live at our community. We have good roads and we can help you get customers or consumers to you or get your crops to market if you know there's a good road in your vicinity. So those were part of, again, the motivations to embrace the idea of improved roads for automobiles. So here's the Lincoln Highway showing up as the blue line that starts over toward 38 and 39 on the right side, or on the left side at the lower corner is the road coming in from western Iowa down into Council Bluffs. Historically, the Lincoln Highway, which was marked with a red stripe, the Lincoln Highway, and an L in text, and then a blue stripe below it, that was a design that was registered in the 19-teens, and so you'd follow the poles, telephone poles or utility poles, telegraph poles that were along the roadway, and that let you know you were following the route. And just some other examples that are part of the east-west routes that you can see on this slide here. I'll bring up a couple of others for you to see. There we go. Sorry, I advanced the slide, not the image. Here's one showing southern Iowa, and you can see an example of the IOA short line, route number 34, that was the shorter route from the eastern border to Council Bluffs. It went from Davenport over to Council Bluffs on a southerly route. It doesn't go through Des Moines. And again, the Lincoln Highway took off out of Clinton, whereas the IOA short line runs from Davenport to Council Bluffs. So if you were trying to make that trip, that was the preferred route that way. Also, like the number 40 running from Lineville in the center of the state up toward Warren County. So you've got the Lineville, Indianola short line that could take you from southern Iowa up to the central Iowa region. So again, it was marked with the LI and a blue stripe on a telephone pole. And then as a northerly route, you'll see what, there's not really a contemporary example of what today is US Highway 20 running from Dubuque to Sioux City, or Sioux City to Dubuque is a continuous route. 29 is a number that if you pick up the route 29 over towards Sioux City, it takes you to Fort Dodge, and then 30 is the number that takes you to Dubuque. So the Hawkeye Cutoff and the Hawkeye Highway, what is close to Highway 20, that one also, if you look at the Hawkeye Highway, instead of dropping south like Highway 20 does today, or staying on a route, it actually jumped a little north. The number 30 did, the Hawkeye Highway, and took you up to Storm Lake, and then kept you going north into Cherokee, and then dropped you down to Sioux City. So the combination of 29 to Fort Dodge, what's routed as 29, the Hawkeye Cutoff, and then 30 from Fort Dodge over to Dubuque is essentially Highway 20 today. So those are some northern Iowa routes. And giving you some north-south routes too. You've got things that are similar to the Avenue of the Saints, Highway 218 today, that took you from southeast Iowa up to northwest Iowa up toward Mitchell County today, so just north of Mason City and a little to the east in that case. That's also you've got the Red Ball route, which took you up to Waterloo. So the Red Ball route number 51, if you can pick that one up, headed towards Cedar Falls, Waterloo. That's a well-known route in eastern Iowa on the north-south route. And then in western Iowa, if you want to follow from Shenandoah up toward Page County in the southwest, if you don't know where Shenandoah is, down there around 42 and 60 and 52. The red line route would take you from the Missouri state line to the north, 53 miles, and then you could pick that one up around Avoca and Atlantic and head north up toward the Iowa Great Lakes. And so no real contemporary version of some of the north-south highways that take you up to Dickinson County. But that's an example of some of those roadways that were being promoted, and you had a wide variety of roads that took you across the state, trying to be improved and having symbols that helped you know you were taking the right route. There are stories of people involved in races across the state of Iowa who either get off the route and so that slows them down, or people that are just taking trips. And again, you lose your way because there aren't great maps at the time. And usually the maps were just designated for a specific route, whether it be something like the White Pole Road. One of the legacies of the Iowa highways and the federal highways that we'll talk about is that US Highway 6, which went from the East Coast to the West Coast or vice versa, it is today, I believe, was the longest road system in the nation. Now it's US 20, which goes through our state. So the federal government gave permission to shorten up Highway 6. That's similar to what happened to the Lincoln Highway. Is today the Lincoln Highway goes across or US 30 goes across at Missouri Valley and doesn't go down to Council Bluffs anymore. So roadways do change over time, as we'll talk a little bit about. And here is the Lincoln Highway showing it going from New Jersey to California. That's US 30. The road was designated in 1913, registered in Iowa in 1916. And even though the highway didn't go through Burlington, the Hawkeye wanted to promote it because it was a major roadway that went from coast to coast. And it really is the first coast to coast planned roadway, the Lincoln Highway. So dedicated in most communities in late October 30th or 31st in 1913. And again, such big news that it made papers in communities even that did not have the Lincoln Highway going through it. And you'll see on the lower right there where it does talk about the improvements on the road, that concrete is to be used. So this is, a new idea, though concrete had been used before 1900 in some experimental ways on roadways. Until automobiles become common, there's no need to go to a concrete roadway. Horses do just as well on soil as they do if and not all horses had shoes, but shoes can be slippery on different surfaces, where if it's a dirt road, you don't have to worry about it. A horse is going to be sure-footed unless the ground is a little frozen or icy. So there was no need until automobiles come around to really have concrete as a road surface. And so you start to see with the Lincoln Highway what's called seedling miles, where a stretch of road will be paved in a stretch to say, hey, just imagine how great this road would be if the entire road was either concrete or asphalt. In Iowa, because we have a decent amount of limestone, we tended to use concrete as our paving surface through the 1950s and 60s. As asphalt became more refined and more available, both became popular. But early on, Iowa was regarded as a concrete state. So there were some social issues around automobiles, and some were for the better. You could easily say it really gave women more independence. Tom Moraine, in his book and interviews for his book Prairie Grass Roots, talks about a woman who just realized how liberating an automobile was. If you had a team of horses, and Tom was writing about Greene County, so Jefferson, Iowa, she realized that she could get in a car and go, especially if you had a self-starter on your automobile. that it gave you a new level of independence. And so it really was, for farm women and town women, something that allowed a higher degree of sociability and also a higher degree of independence. So here's a postcard from our collections, State Historical Society here in Des Moines, of a woman in Rockwell City behind an automobile that is a Ford Model T. And so you do have a new degree of independence for women with automobiles. The only challenge and so would be changing a tire. As we said, maybe not as easy, but if you're just going to visit a friend down the road, it's a lot faster than walking, and you wouldn't, generally women didn't harness horses. I'm sure many of them were capable, knew the system, but throwing a set of harness up on a team of horses and hitching a team usually wasn't regarded as women's work, or something that was appropriate for a woman to do in that period. So one of the things that is then marketed to women is an electric car, and the Milburn Electric, advertised here in the Davenport Democrat and Leader from 1914, sorry about the extra caption there, says the Milburn Light Electric, this introduces the world's first light electric. The Milburn Light Electric, almost a ton less than the average, presents day electric. It is easier to handle and is the only car that a woman can drive safely and confidently in heavy traffic. So those electric cars that come along in the late 1900s, early 19-teens really are being promoted as a vehicle appropriate for women too. So a lot of women are driving electric cars, and the Milburn was one of the more popular. In fact, we have a Milburn Electric that was used in Dallas County in the museum collection. I'm proud to say we'll be opening up the State Historical Building Museum galleries next Tuesday, the 16th. So if you're listening and need an outing, there will be social distancing. We'll have guidelines in place, but you can come see a 1919 Milburn Electric used in Dallas County. So Adele, this one, and again, these electric cars are much like those early gasoline powered cars. They're for wealthy individuals typically. This was used by Arletta Clark. Her husband was George Clark, a former governor. So this car was used in Adele into the 1930s, and they had a grandson whose name was Niall Clark Kinnick. So this is the automobile used by Niall Kinnick, the football player, Heisman Trophy winner of the University of Iowa, whom Kinnick Stadium is named for. It's his grandmother's car. And these electric cars also used tillers. They did not use a steering wheel. So the steering mechanism was a tiller on the Milburn Electric. And there was a little bench seat that faced the driver. So on the right side in the back of the car is where the driver and a passenger could sit, but also on the left side near what is the front window, you can see the headlights on the left. There was a little bench seat too that was set a little below so that the driver had a view, but you could carry 4 passengers in this car. It just was a little bench seat with places for passengers as well. So this is our electric car. And really, electric cars were being promoted for use by women. You'd recharge a battery pack at your home. That was part of Morrison's contribution, really, was developing efficient battery systems for those electric cars. But one of the alarming social issues about the automobile, and these were published all across the state of Iowa, it's just my favorite happens to be from the Burlington Hawkeye of 1921, was the idea of petting parties. And if you have a digital newspaper search, which you can use through Library of Congress, we have worked with Library of Congress on the Chronicling America project. It falls into this 1921 run. That's where you start to see petting parties listed, and it's where young couples would go and park on a country lane and engage in what would be kissing, maybe touching, all consensual, one presumes. And not to make light of that, I'm sorry about that, but that was the idea, was that it was leading to the corruption of America's youth, and that the automobile was giving too much independence to young people. And so you saw these alarming stories about petting parties in various newspapers or commentary on petting parties. So that was one of the social concerns about automobiles. By 1930, as we said, 1926, roadways are standardized. This is a Des Moines, and you don't see horses on the road so much. And this is Des Moines, 1930. We know that because of the All Quiet on the Western Front film playing. It played at the Des Moines Theater in August of 1930. And you see a streetcar in the middle of the road. So in towns, the center of the road was for streetcars typically, and then automobiles on the right side. But you'll also notice on that sign that it talks about the junction of US 32, that federal shield, and US 65. Well, that's again a case where there is no US 32 going through Iowa any longer. It was a roadway that took you west toward Council Bluffs, but the roads, even though they had been given federal numbers, still weren't fully standard even in 1930, but automobiles had come to win the day for Iowans and people all across the country, though farmers were still using more horses than tractors on farms into the 1940s. It's really World War II that causes that change to take place. And you can see on this table here just how that change does take place, where the estimated number is 75 total cars in Iowa in 1900. In 1930, it's 711,000 with 73,000 trucks. So just over 750,000 cars and trucks in 30 years. And even by 1922, it's at 500,000 cars and trucks in the state. So it goes from 0 to 500,000 in 20 years, and another 250,000. Today, there are over 4 million registered vehicles in the state of Iowa. So that's where our numbers are today, is just over 4 million. And I'm going to wrap it up where I started, talking about that reference to the Goodell family of Eden Township, Benton County, Iowa. So on the Lincoln Highway, I like that one too, not just because it does illustrate the challenges that Iowans were facing, but Arthur Goodell was a farmer in Benton County, how farmers and farm families were embracing automobiles to engage in social and what were, in this case, a religious activity to honor a relative who was deceased. But Arthur Goodell is also my wife's great-grandfather. So that was a fun one to find, talking about the Lincoln Highway. And with that, I want to remind you, our next program is June 25th, 2020. Thanks for your time today. And I know Matt may have a question or two, so fire away.
Yeah, thank you, Leo. We have a few minutes to answer some questions at this time. However, before I pose the first question, I want to remind our participants that you can submit your questions still through the Q&A feature here on the screen. We are on a schedule though, so please note we may not be able to get to all the questions before the end of our time together. But here's our first question, Leo. When was the first Iowa roadmap produced, and is there an archive online somewhere?
Ooh, DOT has some of the best examples. Usually, I don't know is when the first, I do not know when the first Iowa highway map from the Highway Commission was established. I know they're around by the 1930s. I would suspect, but I don't know, by 1926 as the federal routes are standardized, that's what lets you designate those. And as the Highway Commission creates the, Iowa Highway Commission creates the state road and the county road system as well. So I would bet by 1935 that they exist. I'm sorry, I don't know the year.
Our next question is about automobile licenses. And do you know if the county courthouses have records of who had the earliest automobile licenses?
Those all went through the Secretary of State, even in the earliest period. So the early ones are Secretary of State. Then as county administration took that on, there may be county records, but that is, I know through state archives, my colleague Sharon Avery is the expert on that. So if you reached out to sharon.avery@iowa.gov, Sharon could answer that question.
Perfect. Our next question, why weren't the Iowa-based car manufacturers more successful in the long run?
Hey, that's a great question. And so I have an answer on that one. you have to consider not just the cost of production, but the cost of getting materials. And so Detroit has available lumber through Michigan forests and Minnesota forests via the Great Lakes. Being on the Great Lakes is such an advantage for Southeast Michigan that it has iron that can come from the Duluth area. So you have iron that then you've got those materials that can be shipped in mass to the Great Lake, through the Great Lakes to Detroit. And so it wasn't that our workers weren't good, it was just getting the materials in mass to Iowa. Just we couldn't do that efficiently. And the ore shipping freighters on the Great Lakes and the ability to move lumber and other material to Detroit made it really advantageous. We had a Ford assembly plant in Des Moines. Ford would make those at the Highland Park plant, the Model T. They would take the wheels and the body off the chassis and ship them separate. And then the Des Moines plant was an assembly plant. So Des Moines had an assembly plant into the 1920s, but we just never could get to the scale and the competitiveness on getting materials and production. So, Colby up in Mason City was one of the last really great efforts. And that was, I think, 1912, 1913. He had great plans. He had been a great entrepreneur up there in the past, but even our smartest people, because of the cost of getting materials here, couldn't adapt the assembly line with the production level that you needed to compete with somebody like Henry Ford or eventually GM in producing mass automobiles.
Perfect. Now we're nearing the end of the hour, so let's end on kind of a fun question, I think. Do you have a favorite car in the museum collection and why?
I really do like the 1913 Buick. So the 1913 Buick was used in Northwest Iowa. A farm family owned it. The granddaughter or the great-granddaughter and her husband, they restored it and donated it to us. It was one that is it's a right-hand drive automobile. And I really do like Arletta Clark's electric car. So those two cars are two of my favorites. And I also like the Cadillac. That's a nice one too.
Perfect. Thank you, Leo. And with that answer, this is all the time we have for today's webinar. Thank you again to Leo for leading our lecture this afternoon. I say this every time we have a lecture online, but I think it's very informative. It's been a very informative lunch, so I've learned a lot today. Also, thank you to everyone joining us as well. We hope everyone can join us in the upcoming weeks and over the summer for future programs hosted by the museum. The next webinar in this series will be on June 25th, and it will continue through August. There are many great stories from Iowa's past to tell in the upcoming months. For more information and to register for future webinars in this series, check out our website at iowaculture.gov. And while you're there, you can look into some of our other fantastic digital programs, such as our weekly Goldie at Home activities for young historians, or watch video recordings of the Iowa Stories series, which is hosted by our Iowa City branch. Thank you all again for joining us today, and have a great afternoon. We look forward to virtually seeing you for the next webinar right here on Zoom on June 25th. Thank you all.